Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. Today I'm going to talk about some prophecies from the Old Testament that correspond to Jesus' timing, traits, and genealogy. And at the end, I will also speak to some of the end times prophecies. What's very interesting and reported by Dr. Michael Brown in his book, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, there is a passage from the Sanhedrin 97a to b, which he added a little bit too, so you can see exactly what this timing means. It states, the world will exist 6,000 years, 2,000 years of desolation, meaning from Adam to Abraham, 2,000 years of Torah, meaning from Abraham to somewhere around the beginning of the Common Era, and 2,000 years of the Messianic era, roughly the last 2,000 years. But because our iniquities were many, all this has been lost. In other words, the Messiah did not come at the expected time. You can find that in Sanhedrin 97a to b. Sanhedrin 97b says, that is the course that history was to take, but due to our sins, that time frame increased. The Messiah did not come after 4,000 years passed, and furthermore, the years that elapsed since then, which were to have been the Messianic era, have elapsed. What happened there is the Jewish people realized that the timing that Jesus was supposed to arrive had elapsed because they did not accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Had they looked back at some of the passages in the Old Testament, they might have realized that Jesus had appeared exactly as predicted. The Messiah in the Old Testament was described in two ways, both as a humble and suffering servant, as reported in Zechariah 9:9, 12:10, Isaiah 53, and Psalm 22, and as a mighty king and conqueror, as reported in Zechariah 14:8-9. In Micah 5, we learn that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, while in Daniel 7, we're told he will arrive by coming on the clouds of heaven. In Daniel 9, we're told he'll be cut off from humanity, while in Isaiah 9, we're told he will live and reign forever. How can these two types of messiahs be reconciled? Some rabbis in Jewish tradition decided that this as follows in Sanhedrin 98a. If the people of Israel will be righteous, the Messiah will come on the clouds of heaven. If they will not be righteous, he will come as a poor man riding on an ass. Jesus reconciles these seemingly divergent messiahs. He is both the suffering servant and the glorious king who will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. His crucifixion was the sacrifice of the strongest for the benefit of the weakest, which is an inversion of the survival of the fittest concept in Darwinian evolution. On Calvary, he reconciled God's perfect love, mercy, and justice. Recall the phrase from Zechariah 9:9 and consider the fact that people just don't ride donkeys anymore, but that was a means of transportation in the ancient world. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Genesis 22 gives us some information on Jesus' genealogy. He has a relationship to Abraham. He also has other relationships. So let's first start with the Abraham relationship. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. In Numbers, we also see the relationship to Jacob. Numbers 24:17 states, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Isaiah 11:1-5 also speaks to Jesus' line up to Jesse. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of other understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness. He will judge the needy. With justice, he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Jeremiah 23:5-6 also states Jesus' relationship to King David. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he will be called, the Lord, our righteous Savior. During Jesus' time, the wealthy were exalted and considered blessed by God, while the poor and weak were considered cursed by God. Jesus exalted the humble, the weak, the sinners, the women, and the poor. Consider the implications of this for people who were the Pharisees. So here you see pictured a Pharisee and Matthew, the tax collector. Jesus exalted Matthew, the tax collector, who humbled himself in the temple when he prayed to God. And he put down the Pharisee, basically saying that God was not going to be listened to such windbaggery. He didn't say it quite like that, but that's how I interpret it. In fact, Jesus said, so the last will be first, and the first will be last, in Matthew 20:16. He also said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, in Matthew 5:5. And of course, this corresponds to what was already mentioned in the Old Testament, in Psalm 37:11. Blessed, but the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. 2 Samuel 7:12-13 also points to David in the lineage. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who I will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Psalm 110:4 further speaks to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Isaiah 7:14 states that he will be born of a virgin, or a young woman who would be a virgin. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. Isaiah 9:6 speaks to the Prince of Peace. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar had captured Judah in 605 BC, and according to the prophet Jeremiah in 25:11, the whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. In 538, God moved the heart of Cyrus, as mentioned by Ezra in 1:1, who allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. Daniel, in Daniel 2, the prophet correctly interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the four kingdoms in his time and those centuries later. In his time, we have the gold, represented by gold is Babylon, silver, Medo-Persia, copper or bronze is Greece, and iron and clay is Rome. He also correctly interpreted the writing on the wall that King Belshazzar saw the same night he was conquered by Cyrus the Persian. The writing on the wall basically told him that his days were numbered. Daniel 9 is probably one of the most interesting passages in the Old Testament, and it's one of the reasons why many people have tried to claim that Daniel wrote his book much later than Daniel himself said he wrote the book. Some people, such as Digital Hammurabi, who's Dr. Josh Bowen, and others, have tried to make the claims that there's much later dating, and they look at the dating by saying that Daniel was writing and was basically inaccurate about the history and was lying to us about a number of different things. But fortunately, we have been able to unearth some archaeology that has corresponded to many of the things that Daniel said. The Nabonidus cylinder and the cylinder of Cyrus are two examples. Furthermore, if the book were written much later than Daniel said it was written, we would have some other issues to think about. For example, why, if it was written in the time that the Greeks had dominated the land, would very few Greek words be in the book? There are only 3 Greek words in the book of Daniel, and the 3 Greek words are referring to musical instruments, which were likely to be present in Daniel's time when Daniel said he wrote it. Furthermore, Josephus makes 2 mentions of the book of Daniel as having been something that Alexander the Great read, and he also made another mention that during Artaxerxes' time, the book and the canon had been closed, and that was hundreds of years prior. So these assertions for later dating, to me, are without merit. In fact, even according to Dr. Bowen himself, one of the reasons he makes the assertions is because then he doesn't have to say that there are prophecies that were fulfilled. Though what's very interesting is this particular prophecy is one that was fulfilled, that even in later dating would not be able to diminish. And let me tell you what this particular prophecy is. Furthermore, you're going to note that the prophecy that the temple, the second temple, in Jerusalem would be destroyed, which is mentioned here in Daniel 9, was something that occurred in the year 70 AD. And no one can make the claim for dating of after 70 AD because the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed, and it's believed that they are between 100, right around 150 years BC. So the very latest dating one can use for the book of Daniel is something that's after 150 BC. Here's what Daniel said. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the end, at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. You can see right here a mention of the destruction of the Second Temple. Here's what Dr. Brown has to say about this. This is Dr. Michael Brown, and this is a reference from his book, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. And you can find this on pages 78 and 79. He says, now we turn to our third piece of evidence found in Daniel 9, 24 to 27, one of the most widely discussed prophecies in the Tanakh. While scholars disagree as to when this chapter was actually composed, everyone understands the historical background presupposed by the text. In other words, the Bible wants us to place Daniel 9 at the end of the period of the Babylonian exile, somewhere in the 530s BC. Daniel had been asking the Lord when the exile would end, having understood from the words of Jeremiah that the captivity in Babylon would last for 70 years. See Jeremiah 25:11 to 12 and 29:10. According to Daniel's understanding, the 70 years were almost over, signaling the time of Judah's restoration. So he gave himself to prayer and fasting, repenting before the Lord for his people's many sins, and asking God to fulfill his promise and bring an end to Judah's exile. Surprisingly, the answer that came from the angel of the Lord dealt with a period far beyond the period of 70 years. In fact, it spoke of a period of 490 years, literally 77s, or 70 weeks, meaning weeks as years, as opposed to weeks of days, an understanding that is almost universal among both Jewish and Christian commentators. But this is where the agreement ends, and the questions and differences of interpretation are myriad. For example, when does this period of 490 years begin? How should the years be divided? What events will transpire in the last week of years? How many anointed ones does the text describe? Actually, for our present discussion, it is not important to have definitive answers for all these questions because the biblical text makes one thing perfectly clear. Final atonement for Israel's sins had to be made before the Second Temple was destroyed. Remember that Daniel's prophecy was received shortly before the rebuilding of the temple and describes the future destruction of the temple in 70. You might say some of these verses are difficult to understand. Maybe so. But what is not difficult to understand is that a period of extraordinary significance in our people's history was about to unfold in which the temple and the city of Jerusalem would be rebuilt and during which, among other things, iniquity would be expiated and eternal righteousness ushered in, all before the destruction of the temple and the city. There it is again. God's solution for sin would be set in place before the year 70 in the Common Era. According to the Jews for Jesus, 77s of years equals a period of 490 years, which is 70 times 7. A 490-year period was decreed for the accomplishment of the final restoration of Israel. The Jews for Jesus link of the purposes of the 77s is as follows. 1, to finish transgression. You can compare that with Isaiah 59:20. 2, to make an end of sins. Isaiah 27:9, Ezekiel 36:25 to 27, and Jeremiah 31:31 to 34. 3, to make reconciliation or atonement for iniquity. 4, to bring an everlasting righteousness. Compare that with Isaiah 1:26, 11:2 to 5, and 32:17, and Jeremiah 23:5 to 6, and 33:15 to 18. 5, to seal up prophecy and vision. And 6, to anoint a most holy place, the Jewish temple. Compare that with Ezekiel 40 to 48. Of 4 options that scholars have determined that they can use to set the start date is one which King Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah to Jerusalem with letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates for protection to rebuild its structures in the month of Nisan in the year 444 BC, as reported in Nehemiah 2, 1-8. Biblical scholars have supported this option and the start date of 444 BC. And compare that with Hainer in 1978. Just as Daniel predicted, Jerusalem was rebuilt, as reported in Ezra 9 and 10 and Nehemiah 4, 6, 9, and 13. This option seems to be the most likely because Nehemiah and Ezra were instrumental in rebuilding Jerusalem and bringing back its exiles. With the blessings of King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem and became its governor in 444 BC. He worked with numerous Israelites to rebuild its walls and structures. Though he faced much opposition, he persisted, knowing that his efforts were supported by the Lord. Of the walls that were rebuilt, 42,360 exiles returned. Ezra spent much time carefully reading them, the book of the law of the Lord. Many seemed unaware of the laws and their many transgressions. They confessed their sins and repented, promising to carefully follow the law in the future by not intermarrying with other groups of people, not working on the Sabbath, and keeping the Lord's house purified. They also purified themselves ceremonially and offered great sacrifices to the Lord. Nehemiah 12:27 says, "At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres." The 77s are divided into 3 separate units, 7 sevens, 62 sevens, and 1 7. During the first time period of 49 years, Jerusalem would be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times, and this occurred. The second block of time, 62 sevens, or a total of 434 years, immediately following the first, for a total of 69 sevens, or 483 years. According to the Jews for Jesus. At the end of the 483-year time period, unto the Messiah, the Prince, the final 7 has yet to come, according to the Jews for Jesus. They estimate the final 7 will be in the end of times. Malachi 3:1 says, "I will send my messenger, who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you desire, will come, says the Lord Almighty." Note that Jesus preached in the temple numerous times. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the temple was destroyed in the year 70. Accordingly, we would realize that the Messiah, or the Anointed One, had to come prior to the year 70. Zechariah 3:8 says, "Listen, High Priest Joshua, you and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant, the branch." Isaiah 42:6-7 says, "I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness." Now imagine this. This is a passage that basically is saying that the Gentiles are going to receive the light. Very extraordinary considering the context of the times. Zechariah 12:10 states, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." Note the word pierced appears in Zechariah 12:10. Psalm 22, 1-15, which was written about 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth, and also far in advance of the time when they had created the crucifixion as a method of torturing people. We have this passage, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You might recall this passage because Jesus said this exact same words when he was on the cross towards the end. He was drawing our attention to this particular passage. As he did in Luke 24, you might remember the road to Emmaus, where he opened the eyes of people traveling on that road to some of the passages in the Old Testament that referenced him. Today, I believe I'm covering some of those same passages. "Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Here's a picture of Jesus with the two criminals hanging on the two crosses beside him. One might recall that one of the criminals, toward the end of his time, determined that Jesus must be our Messiah and Savior, and Jesus granted him paradise and promised him that they would be together in paradise on that very day. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand, according to Isaiah 52, 13 to 15. Now, some Jewish people use the beliefs of some early Jewish people, such as Rashi around the year 1000, to make the claim that this passage from Isaiah 53 is referring to the nation of Israel or the people of Israel. However, what they do not notice when they make this claim is that the person referred to in this is not only a man, but a man who bore our suffering and who was sin-free, without sin. He had no deceit on his lips. He had done no violence. That is clearly not about the nation of Israel, which, like all countries and all people, has sinned. And so this would not be referring to the nation of Israel. It's just a given. But I'll tell you some other reasons why we can't do that as I go through this passage. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Again, note that the people of Israel, many are beautiful. Note that the nation of Israel is beautiful. So clearly, again, this cannot be referencing a nation or people of Israel. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. What does that sound like? Consider the fact that Isaiah was written around 700 years prior to the time when Jesus walked the earth, and again, far in advance of the time when crucifixion had been invented. But we use the word pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Consider the fact that the Passover lamb, which Jesus represented, always had to be without blemish or without sins. Why is that? Because you can't sacrifice a sinful nature to pay for sin. You have to sacrifice one without sin to be able to pay the debt for humanity's sins. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. When I first heard that passage, I heard that passage on a plane, and it was read to me by a pastor that I just had serendipitously happened to sit next to, which I was pretty excited about. The pastor shared with me that passage and asked me who it described, and I said, well, that's Jesus, of course. And then the pastor told me that the passage was written around 700 years prior to Jesus' walking on the earth, which was pretty amazing. Here's a picture of Jesus the Redeemer, which you can find in Brazil, one of the wonders of the world. So, what do we have left? What's coming in our future? And what did the prophet Daniel have to say about that? Well, a holy war is in the future of the world, which will ignite in the Middle East. For 1878 years, the world was without the country of Israel after its complete destruction by the Romans in 70. So predictions about the Antichrist, the Madai, could not have come true. Yet following World War II in 1948, compassion for the Jewish diaspora erupted, leading to the formation of the nation of Israel. Furthermore, the U.S. recently recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and a group called the Temple Institute has formed and is trying to start the process of building a third Jewish temple. Yet its location on the Temple Mount is strictly controlled by Muslims. According to Daniel 11:31, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. You can compare many of these texts with the texts that we see in Revelation, and also with some of the texts that you see in the Quran and other books that are the holy scriptures for the Muslims. Because the Muslims' Christ is the Mahdi, is also our Antichrist. In fact, they reference our Antichrist in the book of Revelation as their Mahdi. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming by today. I hope that you'll like and subscribe and do choose to come again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.